Darren first noticed Caleb because of the way he held himself in the hallway, like the whole building might suddenly ask something of him. The Grief Support Center had the kind of fluorescent lighting that made every face look a little paler, a little more worn. Folding chairs sat in neat rows by the walls. A coffee urn gurgled somewhere behind the sign that said, "Please silence your phones." Darren came in early, already exhausted by the act of walking. He'd rehearsed it in his car. Breathe in, breathe out, find a chair, keep your hands busy so they don't shake. He told himself that grief groups were just rooms where people watch themselves from a distance, quietly, carefully, without demanding anything too personal. But he still felt the dread in his chest like a trapped animal. If he didn't get through tonight, he wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow. That wasn't dramatic. It was practical. His mind felt like it had stopped obeying him. He chose a seat near the back. When the facilitator finally arrived, Ms. Turner, her voice gentle but firm, the room filled with that specific kind of silence where everyone is listening for permission. Darren waited for his turn like it was a verdict. People shared small pieces at first. A man who'd lost a brother talked about the smell of the hospital hallway. A woman with red eyes described hearing a laugh in a grocery store and almost dropping her cart. Darren sat with his notebook open but blank, pretending he could write the right words down. When Caleb stood up, Darren's stomach tightened. Caleb didn't look like the others. Not in the obvious ways. He looked like he'd dressed for weather, not for grief. Dark jeans, a neutral jacket that still had creases, as if he'd taken it off a chair earlier and hadn't fully put it away. But it was his voice that made Darren pay attention. It wasn't loud or performative. It was controlled, like a man who had trained himself to keep feelings in their place. "My name is Caleb," he said, and Darren could hear that he'd said it before in his life, in rooms where he had been asked to be polite instead of honest. Caleb swallowed once, then continued. I lost my brother." No one corrected him. No one asked for details. They all let the shape of the sentence be what it was. Caleb sat back down without giving too much away. Darren expected him to close off after that, to fold grief into himself the way some people fold an umbrella, carefully, quickly, with a kind of practiced restraint. Instead, Caleb stayed awake through the rest of the sharing. His eyes moved slowly from speaker to speaker. When Ms. Turner asked for volunteers, Caleb raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again. The motion was small, but it felt like watching a door open a crack. Darren didn't plan to look at him. He didn't plan to notice the wedding band on Caleb's left hand, the way it caught the fluorescent glare whenever Caleb flexed his fingers. Darren didn't plan to wonder what kind of family kept a man straight in public while carrying grief so heavy it made his knuckles pale. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped softly. The building exhaled in fragments, people exchanging condolences, someone asking if anyone wanted coffee, a few nods that meant, "I'm still here." Darren lingered near the door because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving. He wanted the world to keep its distance one more minute. That's when Caleb approached. Caleb didn't come right up to him. He waited a step away, like he wasn't sure if proximity would be a kind of intrusion. "Hey," Caleb said quietly. Darren's throat tightened. "Hi." His voice came out thinner than he liked. Caleb hesitated, glancing at the seat Darren had chosen as if remembering it. "You looked like you didn't want to be here, but you came anyway." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even advice. It was an observation wrapped in something almost careful. Darren tried to make a joke out of it. His mind couldn't find one. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. Caleb's gaze softened, and Darren felt the tiniest relief, as if Caleb had given him a permission slip to be confused. "You're doing the only thing you can," Caleb said. "You stayed." Darren stared at the door handle behind Caleb, the way his own hand might look if he put it on a doorknob and turned. "It doesn't feel like enough." "No," Caleb said, and the word was steady. "It doesn't, but it counts." They didn't exchange numbers at first. Caleb didn't ask for anything immediately. That was what made Darren's chest ache in a new way. Some people demanded connection like it was a product they were selling. Caleb was different. Caleb offered presence. Ms. Turner called out to the group to take flyers for future sessions. Darren picked up one without reading it. Caleb stood beside him and watched the stack like he was deciding whether he deserved paper. When they stepped into the parking lot, the air was colder than Darren expected. Evening had settled in, and the sky looked like a damp, gray sheet. Car headlights slid across the pavement. Caleb looked down at his phone, then back up. "Do you have somewhere to go?" The question made Darren flinch. It sounded so simple, and Darren's life felt like a complicated knot. "Home," Darren said. Caleb nodded. "Alone?" Darren didn't want to answer. The truth was, his apartment was filled with reminders of absence. Even the silence had learned his habits. "Yeah," he said finally. Caleb didn't press. Instead, he said, "I'm going to drive to get coffee. Do you want to come?" Darren almost said no. He heard himself almost say no the way you almost step back from the edge of a pool. But then he remembered what grief did when you refused to let it have witnesses. It ate you from the inside without moving. "I can," Darren said, "if you don't mind." "I mind," Caleb answered quickly, then softened his tone. "Not like that. I mean, I don't mind having you there." The way he said "there" made Darren feel less like a burden and more like a person. Inside the drive-thru, everything smelled like burnt sugar and stale grease. The speaker crackled. Darren stood in line while Caleb paid, and Darren realized his hands had stopped shaking. It wasn't because the world improved. It was because Caleb's steadiness filled the space Darren's fear usually occupied. They sat in the parking lot with cups warm between their palms. The night around them was quiet. No music playing, no laughter spilling out of vehicles. A few streetlights flickered. Caleb took a sip and looked out at the dark road as if it might speak back. Darren tried to keep it light. He asked about the center. Caleb answered in short sentences, then drifted into something more honest without meaning to. "My family thinks... They think I'm fine," Caleb said. "Like grief is a phase. Like if they don't talk about it, it stops existing." Darren felt something twist. "And you want them to talk?" Caleb's mouth tightened. "I want them to stop acting like I'm a stranger to my own life." He paused. "But if I tell them the real parts, they won't understand. They'll be angry." Darren stared at his coffee. It tasted too sweet at first. It sat too warm against his tongue. "Why would they be angry?" Darren asked, and the words left his mouth before he could stop them. Caleb's eyes shifted toward him, and in the way Caleb looked, Darren felt as if he'd stepped into a room he hadn't been invited into. "Because my brother wasn't just my brother," Caleb said softly. "Because I loved someone the way people pretend they don't." Silence arrived like a curtain falling. Darren's mind didn't know where to put the information. He thought about the wedding band. He thought about the controlled voice. He thought about how Caleb had come to a grief group like he was searching for a place that wouldn't judge him. Darren's throat went dry. Do you get that from them? Like anger?" Caleb's laugh was quiet and not entirely amused. "They don't use the word anger. They use the word disappointment." Darren felt his chest squeeze, not out of shock, but out of recognition. He had lost people too, people who were supposed to love him back. Some families didn't punish with fists. They punished with silence. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "You share nothing about yourself in here." Darren looked down, suddenly furious at himself for having come without a plan. "I don't know how to talk without making it worse." Caleb nodded slowly. "You're afraid someone will look at you and decide you're too damaged to love." Darren's eyes burned. He blinked quickly as if tears were something he could outrun. "I'm not afraid of being unlovable," Darren whispered, surprising himself with how truthful it sounded. Caleb waited. Darren exhaled. "I'm afraid that if I let anyone close, it'll prove that my loss wasn't just mine. It'll become theirs too, and then they'll hate me for it." Caleb's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough that Darren saw the tenderness underneath Caleb's guard. "I don't hate you," Caleb said. The words were gentle but absolute. Darren's breath caught. He turned his head slightly, like moving could fix the sudden heat rising in his chest. After a few minutes, Caleb stood up and stretched. "It's late." He looked at Darren's cup, then at Darren's face. "You don't have to go back alone." Darren's heart pounded. He tried to interpret the sentence in the way his brain wanted to protect itself. Maybe Caleb meant it practically. Maybe Caleb meant it kindly. Maybe it meant nothing. "Why?" Darren asked. Caleb's eyes held his. "Because I know what it feels like to sit in an empty place and convince yourself that you can't ask for comfort without owing someone your soul." Darren swallowed. He could taste the coffee again, and it felt bitter now. He didn't say yes right away. He didn't say no. He sat there with the choice like a live wire in his hands. Then Caleb offered a compromise, soft and direct at the same time. "Stay in my spare room tonight. We don't have to talk much. I don't want you driving in the dark when you look like you're one wrong thought away from shattering." Darren stared at Caleb, confused by how safe the invitation sounded. "I'm not trying to," Caleb began, then stopped himself. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want you alone." Darren's hands tightened around the cup. "You're sure?" Caleb nodded. "I'm sure." Darren stood carefully, as if his body might betray him. They walked to Caleb's car. Caleb opened the door for him, an old-fashioned gesture Darren hadn't expected from someone he'd assumed would keep everything strict and controlled. Inside the car, the heater hummed. Darren stared at the dashboard as Caleb drove. The motion of the streets blurred outside. Darren's mind tried to find reasons to resist. "This is too soon. You don't know him. Grief makes people misread kindness." But the truth was, Darren already recognized the kind of kindness Caleb offered. It wasn't romantic on its own. It was the kind that keeps you alive. Caleb's apartment building was small, older than the new developments downtown. The hallway smelled faintly like detergent and someone's cooking from earlier. Darren's footsteps echoed. Caleb opened his door and stepped inside. The space was tidy without being sterile. There were framed photos on a shelf. Darren paused on the threshold, unsure whether he should look. Caleb noticed his hesitation. "Ignore them," he said lightly, then softened the tone. "They're just reminders." Darren nodded, but his eyes couldn't help drifting toward the photos. Caleb had someone beside him in one picture, arms around Caleb's waist, laughter caught mid-second. Darren's chest tightened. The person in the photo looked like they belonged in Caleb's life, not like an accident. "You lost your brother," Darren murmured, almost to himself. Caleb's expression went distant. "I did. And he wasn't just family," Darren said before he could stop himself. Caleb's breath hitched. He didn't deny it. That silence was its own confession. Darren suddenly became aware of how vulnerable he was standing in a stranger's apartment, wearing a grief that wasn't his alone, but also wasn't theirs. He felt like he might make the wrong move and accidentally break something sacred. Caleb guided him toward a spare bedroom. "Here," he said, opening the door and flicking on a lamp. Warm light spilled over the bedspread. "There's a clean set of towels in the hall closet if you need them. Bathroom's there." Darren touched the edge of the bed as if checking whether it was real. "I can sleep on the couch," Darren offered. "No," Caleb said. The word carried a firmness that sounded like care. "You can sleep in the room. I'm not doing this halfway." Darren looked at Caleb and something in him softened. "Thank you." Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Darren could see the internal conflict in his posture, the way Caleb's shoulders tightened, the way his hands flexed and then stilled. "You don't have to do anything," Caleb said quietly. Darren blinked. "I wasn't going to—" "I know," Caleb interrupted gently, as if he knew how Darren's mind worked. "It's just, I'm straight, right?" The words landed like a confession wrapped in a joke. Darren's stomach dropped. "People say that?" he asked. Caleb gave a bitter smile. "People say a lot of things when they don't want to know the truth." Darren waited. Caleb's gaze held Darren's in the low lamplight. "In my head, I used to be sure, like certainty was a wall I could lean against. But grief, it doesn't care about walls." Darren felt himself swallow around emotion too big for a simple conversation. "I'm not trying to lure you," Caleb said. "I'm not trying to—" Darren cut in softly. "Then why are you asking me to stay?" Caleb's throat moved. "Because when you came out of that meeting, your hands were shaking, and you looked at the ground like it might protect you." He exhaled. "I couldn't stop thinking about you driving alone." Darren's eyes stung. Caleb stepped back as if giving Darren space to breathe. "Sleep if you can." Darren watched Caleb turn away down the hall. Left alone in the room, Darren lay on top of the covers without fully settling. The mattress was comfortable in a way that made his chest ache more. He listened to the apartment noises, pipes, distant traffic, a refrigerator hum. It was the sound of a life continuing. Darren kept waiting for the moment when the kindness would turn into embarrassment. That was what his body expected. His grief had taught him that comfort was temporary. But nothing happened. Caleb didn't barge in. No ulterior motive arrived like an alarm. Minutes passed, then longer than minutes. Darren finally heard Caleb move again. Soft footsteps, quiet motion. Darren sat up slowly, heart thudding. He told himself it was just curiosity. He told himself it was a normal response to a normal person. Then Caleb appeared in the doorway holding 2 glasses of water. The sight of it made Darren's throat close. Caleb looked at him and smiled faintly. "You didn't drink any at the group." Darren nodded once. "I didn't realize." Caleb stepped into the room carefully, like he wasn't sure where boundaries lived. He placed the glass on the nightstand and turned to go. "Caleb," Darren said. Caleb paused, his hand on the doorframe. Darren's voice came out smaller than he wanted. "Are you okay?" Caleb turned back and Darren could see how tired Caleb was underneath the control. It looked like exhaustion that had been building for years. "I'm not," Caleb admitted, "but I'm functional." He took a breath. "I think you get that." Darren nodded. Caleb's gaze dropped to Darren's hands. "You're holding yourself like you're waiting for bad news." Darren swallowed. "I don't know how to be anything else." Caleb stepped closer, not enough to invade, just enough to make the air between them feel charged. "Then borrow my steadiness for tonight," Caleb said. "Just let it be enough." Darren's heart kicked. His eyes flicked to Caleb's lips, then away, as if looking might make something irreversible. "What do you want?" Darren asked, and he hated how vulnerable he sounded. Caleb's voice went softer. "I want you to sleep." Darren almost laughed because it sounded too simple for the way his chest felt. But then Caleb's expression shifted into something more honest. "And I want to stop pretending that you're just someone I happen to help." Darren went still. Caleb exhaled slowly. "I'm not going to kiss you." He said it like a promise, like a safety rail. Darren's breath shook. "Why not?" Caleb's eyes glistened. "Because if I do it now, you'll think it's about you needing comfort. And it would be true, but it wouldn't be the only reason." Darren stared at him, trying to understand what that meant. Caleb swallowed. "I don't want you to be a rescue mission." Darren felt tears spill unexpectedly. He wiped them quickly with the back of his hand, hating the evidence of how quickly he could break. "I'm not asking you to be my savior," Darren said. Caleb nodded and his voice shook a little. "Good, because I can't save anyone." He paused. "But I can stay." The word stay felt like more than an offer. It was a door opening into a room Darren didn't know he wanted. Darren's chest tightened. "Stay," he echoed. Caleb's face softened like relief flooded him. "Okay." They sat on the edge of the bed, both facing forward at first, shoulders close enough that Darren could feel heat from Caleb's body. The world outside the window was dark and indifferent, but inside the room the silence wasn't empty. It was full of unsaid truths. Darren watched Caleb's hands. Caleb's fingers trembled faintly, just for a second, before he steadied them. "You can't tell me you're straight," Darren said quietly, not accusing, just naming what his heart already suspected. Caleb's lips parted, then closed. He looked away like the answer hurt. "I tried," Caleb said. "I tried to live like the labels would keep me safe." "And your family?" Darren asked. Caleb's jaw clenched. They'll never accept the truth, not because they're evil, because they think love has to fit inside a story they approve of. Darren's throat ached. Do they know you're here tonight? Caleb's smile was small and hollow. No, that's the problem. He looked at Darren. They're the kind of people who would rather you disappear than admit they were wrong. Darren didn't know what to say. He felt the urge to reach for Caleb, to hold him and remind him he wasn't alone. But he didn't. He stayed still, honoring the careful way Caleb had offered himself. Caleb leaned forward and rested his forehead lightly against Darren's shoulder. It wasn't a kiss, but it was intimate in the way only desperation can be. Darren felt his whole body react, his heart racing, his breath catching. Caleb's voice was muffled against his shoulder. I thought I could handle the grief by myself. I thought it would make me harder. Darren's eyes closed. Did it? Caleb exhaled. It made me lonely. Darren's tears came slower now, quieter. He turned his head slightly so he could breathe, so he could be part of the moment instead of drowning in it. I'm not your family, Darren whispered. Caleb lifted his head. His eyes searched Darren's face as if searching for permission to be seen. No, Caleb said. You're something else. Darren didn't answer immediately. The room felt too small for the flood of feeling. He didn't want to ruin it by naming it too quickly. Instead, he said, I don't know what you want from me. Caleb's gaze dropped to Darren's lips, then back up. I want to know you, without you disappearing. Darren swallowed. I don't disappear, he said. Caleb smiled faintly like he wanted to believe it. I know, that's why I'm here. They sat for a long time, the night passing like slow water. Darren felt the tension between them transform from danger into possibility. Every time Darren's mind tried to run ahead, kiss, romance, future, he brought himself back to the present. Caleb wasn't a promise. He was a person right here, breathing. Eventually, Darren's eyelids grew heavy. Before sleep fully took him, Darren heard Caleb stand and move around the room. A few minutes later, Caleb returned and sat again nearby. Do you think the group changes anything? Darren asked in a soft, drowsy voice. Caleb's answer came gently. I think it gives you a chance to tell the truth before you break. Darren's heart tightened. I didn't tell the truth tonight. Caleb turned toward him. You didn't have to. I saw you. Darren's chest warmed and he let himself drift. When morning came, it arrived quietly. The light through the blinds was pale and gentle. Darren woke slowly, aware first of Caleb beside him and then of his own heart beating like it had a secret. Caleb was awake too. He was watching Darren with a careful, almost scared calm, like he didn't want Darren to wake up angry. Darren sat up, forcing his mind to catch up to his body. Last night, Darren said. Caleb's shoulders tensed. You don't have to. No, Darren interrupted quickly. I don't regret any of it. I'm just trying to understand. Caleb nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. Me too. They didn't rush. They let the moment be awkward and tender at once. Darren realized how quickly his heart had started to believe Caleb might be real. Caleb stood and made coffee. The smell filled the apartment, grounding them in something ordinary. Darren sat at the table, watching Caleb's hands. They moved with competence, pouring water, measuring grounds, tapping the spoon against the cup. When Caleb sat down across from him, he looked serious. I need to tell you something, Caleb said. Darren's stomach dropped again. Okay. Caleb's eyes held Darren's. My family doesn't know I'm bisexual. Not officially. Not in a way they'd accept. They think I'm straight, and that the way I act is the way I should stay. Darren felt his throat tighten. So why come here with all of that still inside you? Caleb exhaled. Because I couldn't keep living like grief is a test I fail in private. Because losing my brother, it unmasked me. I can't pretend anymore. Darren studied him carefully. And you think they'll reject you? Caleb's jaw clenched. Yes. Darren didn't know how to respond. He cared about Caleb, He also cared about Caleb's safety. "I don't want you to lie for my sake," Darren said finally. Caleb's eyes softened. "I wouldn't." They drank coffee in silence for a minute. The steam rose between them like a veil that could either protect or hide. Darren's phone buzzed with a message notification. He didn't pick it up right away. The screen showed a name he recognized, his older sister. He stared at it like it was an accusation. He felt the familiar dread that came when family wanted access to his grief. Caleb noticed Darren's stillness. "Family?" Caleb asked. Darren nodded. "They keep checking on me." He swallowed. "They think I'm strong enough now, like time is a cure." Caleb's mouth tightened. "It isn't." Darren looked down at his coffee. "No." Caleb reached across the table and placed his hand over Darren's for a moment. It was light. Not a claim, just contact that said, "I'm here." Darren's breath caught. Then Caleb pulled back as if he'd remembered there were still lines they hadn't talked about yet. "Come to group again," Caleb said. "Not because it's therapy, because I don't want to be the only one who shows up with the truth." Darren's throat tightened. "I'll come." Caleb's smile was shaky with hope. "Okay." They left the apartment together, not in a dramatic way, not like a movie. They walked out side by side like two men who still had to learn how to exist in the open without apologizing. On the way, they passed a man loading groceries into his car. Caleb glanced at him without thinking, and Darren noticed how quickly Caleb's posture changed, shoulders tightening, face going neutral. When Darren met his eyes, Caleb looked away. "That's your family?" Darren asked. Caleb shook his head. "Not family," he hesitated. "But it's someone who knows my brother." Darren felt a dull ache. "So they might ask questions." Caleb's lips pressed together. "They always do." Darren swallowed. "Then what do we do?" Caleb stopped walking. The sidewalk was quiet. Birds didn't sing. The city felt too still. "We take it slow," Caleb said. "We protect each other. We don't pretend we can erase what we are, but we also don't throw ourselves into fire." Darren nodded. He believed Caleb, partly because of how scared Caleb seemed. Fear could be honest. When they arrived back at the support center, a familiar face was already there. Miles sat in the lobby, rubbing his palms on his jeans like he had cold blood and no patience for it. He looked like someone who had attended too many grief groups and kept hoping someone would give him a reason to stop feeling guilty. Darren recognized him from the first night, but he didn't expect Miles to talk to Caleb. "Caleb," Miles said, standing with a careful smile. Caleb's body went rigid for half a second. Miles's eyes flicked to Darren, then back to Caleb. "I didn't think you'd come back this soon." Caleb's voice was controlled. "Some things help." Miles nodded slowly. "Yeah." He looked at Darren again, and Darren felt studied, like an outsider being measured for trust. "I'm Miles," Miles said to Darren. Darren swallowed. "Darren." Miles smiled faintly. "You're the one who looked like he was holding his breath the whole time." Darren's cheeks warmed. He didn't know whether to be embarrassed or grateful. Miles sat back down. "I'm glad you're here." Then, without warning, Miles turned to Caleb. "Did you sleep?" Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you asking that?" Miles' expression softened in a way that wasn't cruel. "Because I know what you look like when you don't." Caleb swallowed. He looked like he might say something sharp, then chose restraint. "I slept," Caleb said. Miles nodded once, accepting it like a gift. Darren watched it all, trying to read the complicated chemistry between men who shared grief, but not necessarily comfort. When the facilitator called them in, Darren and Caleb sat together this time. Caleb's knee brushed Darren's under the chair. The contact sent a warmth through Darren's ribs. Darren didn't move away. At some point, Ms. Turner asked if anyone wanted to share a thought about what they were still carrying. Caleb didn't raise his hand this time. His eyes stayed down. Darren felt the weight of Caleb's silence. He wondered if Caleb was afraid that talking would make everything spill out, feelings, secrets, the part of him that didn't match the story his family approved. Darren decided he couldn't let Caleb handle everything alone. When his turn came, Darren stood up. His legs felt steady, but his heart didn't. He gripped the chair back for stability. I lost my brother too," Darren said. The room stilled. Caleb looked up at him, surprise flickering. Darren forced himself to continue. "I didn't plan to say it tonight. I came here because I couldn't sleep, because my apartment keeps ringing with things that aren't there." He swallowed hard. "I'm learning that grief isn't only about who you lost," Darren said. "It's also about what it takes from you. It takes your routines. It takes your certainty. It takes your ability to pretend you're fine." Ms. Turner's voice was encouraging. "Thank you." Darren sat down slowly. Caleb's hand found his under the chair. This time the touch was firmer, not claiming, not demanding, simply saying, "I heard you." After the meeting, Miles approached them in the hallway. "You two were close," Miles said quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "We talked." Miles nodded. "Yeah." He glanced at Darren. "And you helped him." Darren looked at Miles, confused by the certainty in the man's tone. Miles continued, "Your face gives you away. You're not here to be strong. You're here to be seen." Darren's throat tightened. Miles turned to Caleb. "Just don't get careless." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Miles's gaze didn't waver. "You've got a family that will punish you for the truth. You've also got feelings you haven't forgiven yourself for. If you let this turn into something you can't explain, you'll break twice." Darren felt Caleb's tension like a wave. Caleb's voice was low. "And if I don't let it turn into anything?" Miles looked away, as if the answer hurt him too. "Then you'll break once, but it'll feel like it never ended." Silence stretched. Caleb took a breath, then said, "Thank you." Miles nodded once, then stepped back as if giving them space. Outside, the sun had started to peek over the horizon, soft light, pale warmth that didn't erase the cold. Caleb glanced at Darren. "We can't keep doing this in secret," he said. Darren's stomach flipped. "What are you thinking?" Caleb hesitated. "My family lives 2 towns over. My sister's calling me tonight. She's convinced I'm depressed and that if I come for Sunday dinner, I'll snap out of it." He exhaled. "I can't keep answering as if I'm a version of myself that doesn't exist." Darren's mind raced. He pictured family rooms, polite questions, the thin cruelty of forced smiles. "What if they reject you?" Darren asked. Caleb's eyes held Darren's. "They already have the chance to reject me. I just want the courage to find out what kind of love is real." Darren felt himself tremble, not from fear alone, from the intimacy of Caleb letting him witness a choice. "I'm scared too," Darren admitted. Caleb's expression softened. "I know." Darren searched Caleb's face. "If you go, and they say something horrible, promise you won't disappear." Caleb nodded slowly. "And if you hear something that makes you shut down, promise you won't disappear either." They stood close to the curb, morning light catching the edges of their hair. The city smelled like damp pavement and bakery sugar from somewhere nearby. Darren's heart felt exposed. "Okay," Darren whispered. That afternoon, Caleb went quiet as they walked to his car. Darren tried not to overthink. He kept his hands busy by adjusting the collar of his jacket. He kept his eyes on the sidewalk to avoid watching Caleb's face. But grief had trained Darren to notice every sign of change. When Caleb received the call, his phone screen lit up with a familiar contact photo, his sister's face. Darren watched Caleb's jaw tighten. Caleb stepped away slightly to take the call. "Hey," he answered. His voice was careful. Darren pretended to look at his own phone, but he listened. Not to eavesdrop, to understand the atmosphere Caleb lived in. There were moments when Caleb laughed, polite and small. Then there were moments when he answered too quickly, as if speed could prevent the topic from turning dangerous. Darren couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough to feel the danger gathering. "Sunday dinner," Caleb's sister said. Caleb paused. "I don't know if I can—" There was a sharp tone, a familiar family pressure. "Caleb, don't start with this again. You're fine. You're just grieving. We can fix it by being together." Caleb swallowed. I'll think about it. When he ended the call, Caleb looked drained. Darren walked closer. Did she pressure you? Caleb stared at the ground. She asked if I'm seeing anyone. Darren's heart stopped. Caleb's voice went quiet. I told her I'm not. The honesty made Darren's chest hurt. Caleb wasn't lying for fun. He was lying because truth could cost him everything. Darren's mind flashed to last night's words. Stay. Don't make it a rescue mission. Don't throw yourselves into fire. What do you want to do? Darren asked. Caleb looked up. There was a rawness there, like he'd been scraped. I want to tell her the truth. He clenched his fist, then relaxed it. I don't know if I can survive her reaction. Darren moved closer until their shoulders touched. I can't tell you what to risk, Darren said, but I can tell you what I can give. Caleb watched him. I can give you my hand when you walk into that room, Darren said. Not as a secret, not as a rumor, as me. Caleb's eyes filled with something like gratitude and fear braided together. Would you come with me? Caleb asked. Darren's first reaction was panic. Sunday dinner meant family scrutiny. It meant Caleb's story under a microscope. It meant Darren being seen, and Darren's heart didn't trust the safety of being seen. But it also meant not hiding. Darren took a breath. Yes, he said, if you want. Caleb's face broke into relief so immediate it looked painful. Okay, Caleb whispered, as if he'd been holding that word for days. In the days that followed, the grief group meetings became different. Not because the facilitator changed, not because the room suddenly felt warmer. It was different because Darren and Caleb carried something new into it, an unspoken plan, a decision to face the possibility of rejection instead of surviving only by silence. Darren still cried. He still had mornings when his apartment felt too big and too empty. But now the loneliness didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like something that could be shared. He and Caleb began to talk more. Caleb told Darren about his brother's laugh, how it used to fill kitchens. He told Darren about the day the hospital called, about his hands shaking while he signed paperwork and pretended he was numb. Darren told Caleb about his own brother, too. He described the smallest details because those were the only details that felt like truth. The way his brother used to fold towels, the way he never sat with both feet flat, the way he'd hum when he was nervous. Talking didn't bring them back, nothing did, but talking made the absence less monstrous. Miles showed up sometimes, offering quiet, practical support. When Darren looked overwhelmed, Miles would offer a joke that landed just lightly enough not to insult grief. When Caleb looked like he might run from his own life, Miles would sit with him without asking him to explain. Then Sunday arrived. Caleb picked Darren up in the late afternoon. The car smelled like coffee and clean fabric. Darren wore a sweater that made him feel steady, but his nerves were still loud. Hey, Caleb said, glancing at Darren's hands. You're shaking. Darren forced himself to relax. I know. Caleb turned his steering wheel a little slower. You don't have to be fearless, you just have to be here. Darren swallowed. Okay. As they drove through neighborhoods that looked like they belonged to calendars, Darren felt the difference between public and private life. In public, people smiled too much. They made comments about the weather and kept their curiosity polite. Private life was where people decided whether you were allowed to exist. When Caleb's family home appeared, an older house with a porch light still on, though it wasn't fully dark yet, Darren's heartbeat turned heavy. Caleb parked and turned off the engine. They sat for a moment in the quiet. Whatever happens, Caleb said, voice low, you don't owe them your shrinking. Darren nodded. His eyes stung. I'll stay. Caleb's hands rested on the steering wheel like he was holding himself together. Then he looked at Darren and said, I don't want you to be collateral damage. Darren reached across the console and placed his hand over Caleb's. Then don't treat me like I'm the risk. Caleb's breath shook. They stepped onto the porch together. Caleb took one breath in, then another. Darren could feel the decision in his posture, the way Caleb lifted his chin like he was finally done apologizing for existing. Inside, voices drifted from the living room, warm light, the smell of cooking, meat, garlic, something sweet in the air. A woman appeared first, Caleb's sister. Her expression tightened with forced friendliness. "Caleb," she said, "you made it." Caleb's voice was polite. "I did." Then he looked at Darren and, very carefully, intertwined their hands. Darren's breath caught. Their fingers fit together like they'd been practicing in secret. The sister's smile faltered. Her eyes darted between their hands, then to Darren. "And who's this?" she asked. Caleb didn't flinch this time. "This is Darren," he said. He's important." Darren felt his body go cold. He expected anger. He expected disgust. But he also expected the worst because his grief had always prepared him for impact. The sister blinked once. Then she laughed, small and disbelieving. "You brought a friend?" she asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "No, not a friend." The kitchen went quiet in the way it does when people realize the script has been thrown out. Darren felt his heart hammer. He wanted to pull away, to run. He wanted to become invisible so the air would return to normal. But Caleb didn't let his hands slip. "I'm not playing games," Caleb said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, it was steady. Darren heard his own pulse in his ears. The sister's face tightened with fear disguised as control. "Caleb, I don't understand. I thought you were—" "I was telling you what you needed to hear," Caleb said, "because I was afraid." The words hung there like something fragile. The sister swallowed hard, and Darren saw a flicker of something else. Hurt, confusion, maybe even grief. Not for Darren, not exactly. Grief for the story she'd built. Then an older voice interrupted from the living room. A man, Caleb's brother-in-law or father figure, spoke with the authority of someone who expected compliance. "What is this?" the man asked. Caleb's shoulders rose and fell. "It's who I am." Darren looked at Caleb. He couldn't tell whether Caleb was terrified or relieved. Maybe both. The older man's expression turned sharp. "We don't do this in this family." Darren's stomach dropped. Tears threatened again, a familiar instinct. Caleb squeezed Darren's hand once, a grounding pressure. Darren inhaled. He didn't have the power to change everyone. He only had the power to remain present. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Darren said, voice shaking but not breaking. "I'm not asking you to approve of me. I'm asking you to treat Caleb like he's a person, not a mistake." The room held its breath. For a moment, Darren thought it would turn into screaming, into punishment, into Caleb getting pushed out of his own life. But then the sister's eyes filled. She looked away quickly, as if tears were a weakness she couldn't afford. "I don't know how to talk to this," she whispered. Caleb's voice softened. "You don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to stop pretending you never saw me." The sister looked back at him. "I saw you," she said, and the sentence cracked. I didn't know what to do with it." The older man scoffed under his breath, but even his scoff sounded less certain now. Darren watched, stunned by how human this moment was under all the fear. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it wasn't the instant cruelty Darren had rehearsed in his mind. The sister stepped closer to Caleb, not touching him yet. Can we start with dinner?" she asked, voice rough. Caleb nodded once. "Yes." Darren felt a rush of emotion that wasn't triumph. It was relief so soft it almost didn't count. They sat at the table. Plates clinked. Conversations circled around safer topics like sports, weather, work. Darren felt like he was walking on glass made of politeness, but Caleb's hand stayed near his. Every time Darren looked down, he found Caleb's fingers curled against his own knuckles. After dinner, the sister cleared the table quickly, using motion to avoid emotion. When she passed Darren by the kitchen doorway, she paused. Her eyes were shiny. "I didn't know," she said. Darren swallowed. "I know," he replied gently. The sister shook her head. "No, I didn't know you'd be this kind." Darren looked down for a second, surprised by how much that mattered. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I still don't know what to call you, but You can come again. Darren's breath caught. It was not a full promise. It was not a flawless ending, but it was a door that had moved. When Caleb walked Darren back to the car, his expression was tense again, like he was bracing for another wave. Are we okay? Darren asked. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. We're not okay, Caleb said honestly. Then he looked at Darren with a kind of courage that felt earned. But we're together. Darren's eyes burned. And what if they never accept? Caleb leaned his forehead lightly against Darren's. Then I'll accept myself, he whispered. I can't keep living like love is a crime. They stood in the driveway as the porch light flickered once, then steadied. The night air smelled like cut grass and car exhaust. Darren's heart felt both terrified and grateful. When they finally got into the car, Darren didn't ask for more than Caleb was willing to give. He didn't push for a confession they weren't ready to make. He only looked at Caleb and said, "Stay." Caleb's smile trembled. "I'm here." Darren closed his eyes, letting the words settle into his bones. That night, Caleb drove them back to his apartment again. He didn't rush the door. He didn't rush Darren. He simply carried a silence that felt companionable, like a blanket. When they reached the spare bedroom, Darren didn't feel like he was waiting for the kindness to become a mistake. He lay down beside Caleb, shoulder to shoulder. Their hands found each other under the covers. Caleb didn't pretend it wasn't real anymore. "I won't lie to them," Caleb said quietly, as if continuing yesterday's sentence into a softer place. "But I won't abandon you either." Darren's throat tightened. "I don't want you to abandon yourself." Caleb's breathing slowed. "I think I'm learning." Outside, the city kept turning. Inside, two men held on through grief and fear and the slow miracle of truth. Darren didn't know what the future would bring, how many conversations they'd have to survive, how many family dinners would ache, how many nights would threaten to pull them apart. But he knew one thing with a certainty that felt new. Caleb had asked him to stay once in a way that mattered, and Darren had answered. And now, when Darren heard Caleb shift beside him, he didn't feel like he was alone in the dark. He felt chosen, not by destiny, by a man right here choosing again and again. Neutral studio background, soft lighting, photorealistic.